I wanted to start today by taking some time to discuss a few of the questions you sent me. So there were two main issues that came up. First, is Dugin really a philosopher, like I've been presenting him? Or is he primarily a political person who opposed certain political realities and then had to build a philosophical castle in which his politics could dwell, as one of you put it? Another way of stating it is this: is Dugin primarily a philosopher or a political theorist? So he has books with the title political theory in them, like the Fourth Political Theory, which you may know, one of his major ideas and best known works. And in that case, he's clearly aligning himself with political theory and referring to his work as a work of political theory. But he also has books with the word philosophy in the title, like Martin Heidegger, The Philosophy of Another Beginning, and Martin Heidegger, The Possibility of Russian Philosophy, where political theory doesn't seem to be in the forefront at all. In his interviews, he tends to refer to himself as a philosopher. But, as most of you know, his reputation primarily concerns his politics. And by the way, it's a completely fair question. It's one, I think I could even say, it's a question that was, in its own way, the foundation for the disagreements that I had with my dissertation committee at the University of Toronto. And in general, when I try to treat Dugin as best as I can with philosophical empathy, I do end up presenting him as a philosopher and treating him as a philosopher, whereas the common opinion about him doesn't see him that way. So if we reflect on that, it's not only about the question of Dugin, it's really about how we define the difference in the enterprises of political theory and political philosophy, generally speaking. So how do we think about the difference between what it is to be a philosopher and what it is to be a primarily political or primarily a political theorist? Even if you look at how Dugin defined Noomakhia in our first session, where he said that nous is the war within nous is the war that's the father of all things. Well, nous, or intellect, might be a philosophical idea, but war, struggle, conflict, remember, it's on one level noetic, on the other level theological, and on one level political, but it all reflects what's taking place within nous. So is Noomakhia, the very concept, primarily political or philosophical? Well, it would seem to be somehow a combination of both of them. This work, Political Platonism, has as its first chapter a partial transcript of a lecture that Dugin gave at Moscow State University on what we would call political philosophy, and the strict notion there is the philosophy of politics. And this question comes up in the forefront of Dugin's own introduction to what political philosophy is. What is the relationship between these two elements in it, between the political and the philosophical? We may have our own idea of how those two things relate, but it's helpful when we're trying to get a sense of Dugin's self-understanding to look at his own presentation. And in this presentation, he says, any philosophy at all, even the most abstract philosophy, has a political dimension. Philosophy and politics, he says, have an unequal but very deep organic connection. They're unequal because politics without philosophy is not possible at all. Quote from page 2. Politics, he says, is a form of applied philosophy. It is the application of philosophy to a certain sphere of human life. Politics presupposes philosophy. Philosophy without politics, however, is possible theoretically. That is, there is a philosophy that does not occupy itself with politics, but there's no politics that is not based on philosophy. So that's the inequality. Well, does that mean that for Dugin, what's the status of purely theoretical or purely philosophical philosophy? Well, he says here that basically there is always an implicit political dimension to philosophy. So philosophy can proceed without turning its attention to that implicit political dimension. But in the best case, it brings that dimension out expressly. So any philosophical system, as he puts it here on page 4, carries in itself a political dimension, but not every philosophical system develops this model explicitly. In other words, a philosophical politics is not even a coherent notion for Dugin. It may be badly philosophical, it may be erroneous, but it always implies a philosophical outlook. And so I think even the concept of Noomakhia as combining the philosophical and the political is helpful for us to look at. So that's just something to keep in mind if you also were wondering how best to understand these dimensions in Dugin's thought. Comment? Yes, I agree. And he does. In Noomakhia, he explicitly discusses the law of the excluded middle as Apollonian, because, you know, for Dionysus is the middle, so to speak, although that has a different sense logically. But remember that for him, all of these things are transposable images in a sense. And also even the law of identity, so that something is equal to itself. He considers that to be Sibyllian to a certain extent, because everything is not only itself, but also a symbol pointing beyond itself. I mean, as he writes in Noomakhia, without getting into the details. So there definitely is that dimension in his work, that what we regard as dry, abstract, formal or symbolic logic has a political dimension. There's something else that we can add potentially to consideration, which is slightly to the side from Dugin, but I think it's in the spirit of his analysis, which is something like, well, let me not even go there. I had in mind, you know, the continental divide, by the work by Peter Ellie Gordon about the sort of geopolitics of the origin of analytic philosophy. But we can even leave that question to the side and acknowledge that, yes, even formal logic has this quote unquote political dimension. But what's not always obvious, so if you say to somebody logic is political, or, you know, logic reflects masculinity or something, on the face of it, those utterances are nonsensical or, you know, laughable or easily dismissible. What I wanted and still want to accomplish in this seminar is for us to get a sense of how at least they become comprehensible in light of how Dugin understands this basic idea of the three logoi. And just because it's comprehensible doesn't mean we have to accept it, but at least we'll understand it more than we would if he just said, oh, you know, law of excluded middle is like racist or something, which wouldn't necessarily be all that helpful on the surface of it. Another topic that came up in the questions that were emailed to me was about Dugin as a critic of universalism and himself as a relativist. So sort of this relationship between relativism and critique of universalism. And here I think it was even referenced in one of the questions. There's a clip of Dugin on the BBC, being interviewed in English on the BBC, where he says to the interviewer, you have your truth and we have our own special Russian truth. So I'm going to try to play that for you through screen sharing. And if it doesn't work, then I'll just tell you what he says. So just a second here.
Everything is relative, and we in Russia, we could use postmodernity in order to explain to the West that if any truth is relative, so we have our special Russian truth that you need to accept as something that maybe is not your truth.
Even if it's not true.
But if the truth is relative, that doesn't mean that the truth doesn't exist.
Well, he says that all truth is relative. And if all truth is relative, Russia can use that postmodern observation or insight or postulate, whatever you want to call it, to say that, look, Russia has its own special truth. So Russia can defend its, as it were, like, epistemic sovereignty or something like that. The fact that it can make its own, it can declare for itself the meaning that things have for it. I mean, he doesn't say all of that in this first 10 seconds. He says, truth is relative. We can use that postmodern insight to declare that Russia has its own special postmodern truth. Sorry, Russia has its own special truth. And a few people in the last little while have mentioned that interview to me, specifically those opening, 10 seconds, but even it's 10 minutes. But if you watch it, pretty much there's a lot of that type of claim. So people have mentioned that to me as a sign that Dugin is not a serious thinker. And they say, and I think it's fair to agree with them to an extent, that his claims in that video don't seem to rise above what you can expect of an untutored schoolboy who's just discovered relativism as an option. Like imagine someone who just for the first time has started philosophizing with his buddies and gets wind of the idea that truth is relative. And like, that's just your truth. You've got yours, I've got mine. It doesn't come across as particularly convincing or particularly sophisticated. However, there is, I believe, more to Dugin than comes across in that interview, as I hope you've started to see already. And you can understand his claim about Russia having its own special truth in terms of what he has already said in this book about the historial, which remember, basically is the idea here that the meaning of an event will differ depending on the space and time in which it's interpreted. So if our here and now is the modern West as the culmination of progress through barbarism and savagery and superstition and so on, events will have one meaning, but in a different historial or timeline of interpretation, they'll mean something else. So another way of stating that is that the meaning of an event will differ. I mean, another way of stating it that's also from this book we're reading is that the meaning of an event will differ based on the structure of interpretation as analyzed through the thesis of the three logoi. So you could even say that any event, like at the simplest level, any event has at least three interpretations. Obviously, it has many more, I say at the simplest level. The Apollonian interpretation, the Dionysian interpretation, and the Sabellian interpretation. And there's an example of that we'll get to as we go through the session today concerning the idea of a crisis of the West. The Apollonian logos, the Dionysian logos, and the Sabellian logos will each interpret the idea of a crisis of the West differently. So when Dugin says that Russia has its own special truth, without getting into further explanation, it's not necessarily clear, but we now are getting some of the conceptual resources to understand it. And a third way of saying it, so the first one is that, our historial, our line of interpretation will be different. Second way of stating it is that the three logoi will interpret an event differently. A third way, compatible with the methodology of Noomakhia, is that differences of meaning, interpretation, and truth are rooted in the many Daseins, the existential plurality of Dasein. So I wrote in my notes that it's good that we're reading this because it helps us to make sense of what Dugin means when he says things that might appear to be trivial or ridiculous or overly simplistic, even, of course, if we end up disagreeing with him after having understood him. So let me stop and ask you now, is there some point that you'd like to make or raise about his critique of universalism or what you might see as his relativism? Well, that's a good question, and both are on the table, okay? From the point of view of Noomakhia, both are on the table, that something is given, and then what varies is its interpretation. But, as it happens, Dugin writes about that very point. So he says that we should consider, and let me just see, I believe it is in the section. So just to let you know what I'm looking at volume 1, okay, the methodological volume of the three logoi. Chapter 1, in the introduction, chapter 1 we discussed. Chapter 2 we started to discuss last time. Then chapter 3 is on Plato. Chapter 4 is on Aristotle. Chapter 5 is on Plotinus. And the point that relates to what you made is chapter 6 on Gnosticism, Valentinian Gnosticism, Sophia and the structure of the female logos. And you may not sort of have expected this at the start of that chapter, but what he says is this is not a conflict of interpretations in the context of a guaranteed, but of an object that's guaranteed or given, but open for our interpretation, basically. So it's not a conflict of interpretations. It's something much deeper and primordial. It's a battle or a struggle or a war for the object itself. as equally as for the subject, for a primordial matrix, onto-gnosiological matrix, gnosiology being the knowledge side, onto being the existence side. So for a onto-gnosiological matrix that precedes both the object and the subject. Okay, that's what Dugin says. In other words, we could interpret it as a conflict over interpretation of the given, but we can also interpret it as the matrix that determines what's given in the first place, that level. And that's what he says. I mean, he opens chapter 6 with that very observation. My structure for today was a little bit different from the previous sessions. Probably you can already see we've spent the first 20 minutes on discussion, which is great. But also I have here some other writings on Noomakhia, some interviews and so on, some recent publications from outside of the book that I think help us put some of the parts in context, because that's just, in a way, the biggest challenge. So I have a couple of things that I want to read to you from an interview that helps put gives us a glimpse into Dugin's self-understanding and just provides some more context for what we're talking about. And then later, the discussion will sort of be like on a number of topics to see how Noomakhia and its distinctions are applied in different ways. So let's just start here with this excerpt from the interview. So he says, I started by publishing a small Noomakhia. So there's like the lesser and the greater, okay? The lesser Noomakhia has 5 volumes. That's what we've been looking at, the methodological foundation of the methodological foundations of even the greater Noomakhia are these first 2 volumes. But initially there were just five volumes. Now he says, I'm finishing a large 24-volume Noomakhia. And by the way, I think there are even more volumes now. He's wrapping it up with 3 or 4 volumes on the Russian logos. So it was 5, now it's 24. But I understand very well, he says, that these 24 volumes, if you take them seriously, imagine that you took them seriously, is actually nothing but a table of contents of a 240-volume edition. It's just an extended table of contents with theses. So, in other words, in Dugin's own self-understanding, this is a project that is nearly, if not actually, inexhaustible. The richness of civilizational multipolarity is not just a tabulation of the civilizations and a tabulation of the logoi and some simple superimposition. It's so much so that 24 volumes could be a table of contents for 240. So I thought that was an important point. Yeah. Okay, here's another passage. So he says, I tried as much as possible not to be a Russian Orthodox patriot when studying various societies, for example, the Pygmy Society, because the Russian Orthodox patriot in a Pygmy society has absolutely nothing to do, doesn't belong there. And if he's a Western liberal or a supporter of communism, he also has absolutely nothing to do with Pygmy society or nothing to do in it, because he will be broadcasting, Dugin says, a different form of his own ideas. So in other words, remember, he says, I tried as much as possible not to be a Russian Orthodox patriot in the course of these studies. I mean, during the study part of it, as you'll see in a second. In other words, in studying the other civilizations, he explicitly had to bracket his own identity, at least to the extent that it could prejudice what he would find there. My task from the very beginning, he says, was preserving my Russianness without compromising it at all, to postpone it for the duration of the study. Well, that's interesting, I would say, in and of itself. And I also think it's what we must do when studying Dugin, whether we are liberals or social democrats or the alt-right or anything else. We have to postpone our identity for the duration of the study of Dugin in order to understand him. I mean, that's what he has done for others, and that's what he would like done for himself. But I add here, parenthetically, postpone it without compromising it. So another point from the interview that I think it's helpful to keep in mind as I give you this. By the way, the idea that the 24 volumes are basically a table of contents for 240 volumes tells you in a way how insane it was on my behalf to propose and on your behalf to accept the idea of an introduction to Noomakhia, because we're trying to cover 1 or 2 chapters from an introduction to something that's much, much bigger. And still, I think, and I hope, and I'm doing my best to ensure that you'll find some benefit in understanding Dugin and our world more broadly through this introduction. But You see, it's sort of a fool's errand in that sense. So another point from the interview that we should keep in mind is that Dugin, in not everywhere, but at least in this project, tries to avoid an oversimplified or one-dimensional understanding of a civilization. I say here and not everywhere because you can find websites and you could probably find writings where you do get a oversimplified or one-dimensional understanding, but not in Noomakhia. So he says, if we understand how dynamic and generally changing in the course of time is the attitude or balance of these three logoi. So remember, they're dynamic. Their relationship is dynamic. Which one is in the front, which one is behind, and which is superimposed on which, and so on. All of that is dynamic. So if so, then it becomes clear that when we say, I am Greek, or I am French, or by extension, I am Russian, we're not saying anything. Because Greek, where Greek, when Greek, for what? The question is, what kind of Greek are you? Meaning there's not a simple Greek logos or a simple Russian logos, but to be Greek or whatever is a complex phenomenon with its own pulses and periodizations and nuances. So there's no oversimplification in that sense. And the methodology of Noomakhia is supposed to help us analyze some of that complexity in terms of the various world configurations. So Dugin also acknowledges the fact that the logoi do not strictly correspond to or overlap with national borders. So it's not like he thinks the Russian logos is here, the German logos is here, the French logos is here within strictly defined national borders. I agree, he says, and also that they're kept radically distinct from one another. I agree, he says, that we live at the intersection of cultures and the intersection of various paradigms. This is true. There is no strict border from one logos to another, as is the case with national states, where here is France and here ends Germany. These intersections, the intersections of the logoi, are frontiers where there are such diffuse processes of the logoi, depending on the prevalence of one or another, their concentration, and so on. And they often, he says, have fractal trajectories. These are turbulent processes. So commenting now on that passage, what I wanted to draw your attention to here is how he describes, as it were, the geometry of the three logoi on the geosophic plane. And geosophic for him, you know, if I were to say geographical, you would understand. If I were to say geopolitical, you would probably understand. Well, geosophic just means interpreting the geopolitical space in terms of its noetic character. So this intersection of the logoi and the geopolitical space gives us a geosophic dimension. And the language he uses to describe that is fractal, turbulent, and chaotic, as in chaos theory. It's not all clear-cut and planar. So, for example, he writes, in the theory of chaos, that he just is going to give us this analogy. In the theory of chaos, the process of boiling is investigated. So water. Is the water boiling or not? Okay, well, there are bubbles already, but how are they moving? You know, how many bubbles are there? Does this count as boiling yet? Well, all sorts of formulas begin which determine where the water boils, where it has not yet reached a boil, where it already has. And these processes, especially when the boiling occurs, he says, is in terms of chaos theory anyways, not in terms of it, but in light of it, a mystery. It's impossible to determine the exact point when this process begins. So in the same way, he says, diffuse transitions occur. The boiling of one logos, transition to another. For example, the Catholic logos of the Teutonic Order, the logos of the Russian princes of the era of the Mongol conquests, and the logos of the Mongols in the Golden Horde are the same logos, the logos of Apollo, everywhere, in all three cases. But what a struggle between them. What a geopolitical tension. End quote. So although we're beginning to highlight the basic contours of these logoi, of the Apollonian, Dionysian, and Sabellian, it's crucial to get the sense, I think, that Dugin tries to convey, that there are all of these nuances and struggles, not only between them, but also within them, indeterminacies, fractal, turbulent, chaotic. He emphasizes in the second volume on the so-called horizontal or geosophical dimension, that all of the differences basically get multiplied, my term, not his, by all of the differences on the horizontal plane. So he even gives the example that, the horizontal plane is not strictly speaking horizontal. It can come at all of these different angles. The vertical can come at all of these different angles. Also, you have reflection and shadow and the different types of terrain and so on. So whatever metaphor he's using, he's trying to convey what he thinks is somehow inexhaustible and incalculable richness, and yet somehow amenable to analysis through this methodology. Is that helpful? I have some examples in the notes here as we move forward. And again, we are just talking about not even all of volumes 1 and 2. The initial slices of this basic methodology, what the distinctions are, what he means by them, that they are somehow related to his Heideggerianism as an expression of Dasein, which we'll get into also probably next session because it reoccurs in the part that we'll be treating then. So to get a sense of that, but if you wanted to go on further and see the concrete application, civilization by civilization, that's the next 24 volumes, as a table of contents for the next 240. And yet, I will say in the session today, give some examples of how he applies this terminology or this set of concepts to help bring certain things to light. And we'll see whether it's helpful to do it using these particular terms, or whether it how can I say, confuses more than it clarifies, or whether we could have done just as well with some other set of concepts. So we haven't yet gotten really to the question of application, but I hope to bring some of that up through some examples today. Good. We finished last session talking about how logos and the philosophical and the mythological are transposable. You remember, philosophy is not just the outcome, the maturity of mythology, but they are transposable because they both stem from nous. Well, he says, remember, we can think of Noomakhia in terms of schools of philosophical thought, or in terms of the battle of the giants and the battle of the titans and other such figures from mythology. Just a reminder of where we ended off last session. I also said that for Dugin, the schools of classical Greek philosophy that correspond to the 3 logoi, because we had our various correspondences to the modes of imagination in Gilbert Durand and so on. Also just to light, dark, and black, and so on. Well, the schools of classical Greek philosophy in that chain of correspondences were Plato as the Apollonian logos, Aristotle as the Dionysian, and the atomists as the black logos. It won't be our goal today to go over each of those schools, although I will talk a little bit about why Dugin uses Aristotle as his example of the Dionysian logos in that context, because it's not an obvious thing to do, as he himself admits. Our main goal will be to continue to better distinguish these logoi and to start to see, to your point, how Dugin applies them in analysis, only to start to see. So I thought it would be helpful if we clarify something about the Dionysian logos. Now, outside of the context of Noomakhia, what would you say, or what do you think people mean when they talk about Dionysus? So what, in other words, does ordinary opinion associate with this god Dionysus, or with the Dionysian? So again, outside of this whole context, what's the usual understanding or more ordinary understanding? Okay. And what would be a customary sign of the liberated or of the vivacious, like images associated with Dionysus? I think that's a big one, and Dugin has that in mind in this section of the discussion. Drunkenness, wine, orgies, okay, art, maybe, that kind of thing. Do you think that's fair to say? Or as part of the ordinary understanding outside of this context of Dionysus. So Dugin knows that, and he specifically says that he wants his readers to guard against that. And so let me read you, I'd like to read you the relevant passage, which it's not in this book, but it's in another interview with Dugin, and it belongs to the theme of Introduction to Noomakhia. So again, this is going to help us to distinguish the Dionysian logos, in case we still think about it in terms of drunkenness, wine, orgies, and so on. So in the theme of Dionysus, he says, we often yield too readily to aesthetic connotations, and let ourselves be captivated by luxuriant and garish descriptions of processions, orgies, and mysteries. I approach the figure of Dionysus, he says, abstractly and philosophically. Although precisely Nietzsche, who saw a philosopher in Dionysus, did that first. But philosophy always frees itself from the plastic figures and goblets of the aesthetic, reforming fascination into something more free and transparent. I see in Dionysus, he says, a logos, that is, a paradigmatic structure of correspondence between itself and the corresponding semantic interpretation, in other words, the semantic interpretation of the fundamental theological, ontological, and gnosiological or epistemological aspects of philosophy. Okay, so he treats Dionysus philosophically. Accordingly, he says, the Dionysian logos is fully separate from myth, but at the same time, as we saw, it can return to it, owing to the homologies that permeate all of Noomakhia, the transposability. So this allows us to operate with Dionysianism entirely freely, independently of the plastic, aesthetic, and emotional side. Plastic aesthetic means, the art component and the aesthetic component. So the logos of Dionysus is not tied strictly and inextricably with wine, orgies, bacchanalia, satyrs, or the rites of the Dionysian cult. And I mention that because, again, in case for some people that's still the default way of thinking about it. But it can, in certain circumstances, become a matrix for these things, just as also for a number of other religious and cultural phenomena that are not directly connected with historical Dionysianism and that are aesthetically rather remote from it. Okay, so that's the first point. That it's a matrix for what we understand as historical Dionysianism, but can be abstracted from it, and that Dugin treats it as abstracted from it. And now, the philosophical meaning of Dionysus in this context, the logos of Dionysus is the logos of immanent, like embodied, as opposed to transcendent, immanent divinity. At its center, so this is now going to be, now we're getting into a theoretical delineation of Dionysianism. So this may be more difficult to grasp for some of the listeners, but let's try it. So the logos of Dionysus is the logos of immanent divinity, but at its center is the fact of epiphany. Okay, now the explanation. We often understand epiphany as a theophany, as God's showing, the showing of a God. But the very term epiphany, he says here, I'm just using the translation that was provided, is splendid. The very term epiphany, we don't necessarily need to think of it as a theophany, as an appearance of God. We can just think of it as an appearance. Okay, well, how does that work? Epiphany, he says, is appearance. Something appearing. It is not yet God appearance, theophany, the appearing of God or a God. But it is no longer simply a phenomenon or a simple appearance. So it's the appearing prior to the appeared. Okay, so it's the act of appearing prior to the thing that has appeared. But at the same time, he says, it is not merely any appearance indiscriminately or appearing indiscriminately. It is something uncommon that compels us to be genuinely astonished. Which, incidentally, when you think back to what we said last session about distancing ourselves from our historial, from our customary way of interpreting the meaning of philosophies, in order once again to experience the drama and wonder of it, well, that is Dionysian, because again, we want to be genuinely astonished by something uncommon. Okay, so epiphany is the sphere of Dionysus. Dionysus is the god of epiphany, the immanent sacred. Plato builds his philosophy. Now remember, Plato is the Apollonian Logos. Plato builds his philosophy and even theology on the transcendent. For him, what is most important is in epiphany, in the appearing, is he who who appears or that which appears. So not just the fact of something, but what it is itself. We want it to be the substantive good, the highest idea, and so on. The idea of the good. Thus, the entire world of appearances is an icon of the world of ideas. It points beyond itself. It's a copy of an original that lies in the world of ideas. For Aristotle, Dugin writes, and here we get our first taste in this context of how Aristotle correlates with Dionysus. Epiphany is the center of the phenomenon. So we're not interested in the what it is that's revealed, but the epiphany is the center of the phenomenon and comprises the essence of the phenomenon. A little bit more to go on this quotation. In the phenomenon, what is important is not what appears, the eidos, form, paradigm, essence, or idea. So not what appears, but the peculiar fact of appearance as such, the epiphanic dimension. This is the dimension of Dionysus. One can become convinced of the relevance of such an interpretation of Aristotle, Dugin writes, if one does, as I have done, in discarding the aesthetic and cultural historical sides of Dionysianism. The logos of Dionysus is the basis for a philosophy of epiphany. So we already said in the last session, Dionysus is between light and the light logos and the black logos. He is the transition between the winter and the summer. You know, he is the twilight, as we'll see a little bit more, the twilight. Well, the philosophical correlate to all of that for Dugin is as opposed to the Apollonian world of ideas being primary, and as opposed to, as we'll see later, the Sabellian matter being primary and all of its various interpretations. Here you have the moment of appearance, somehow combining those two, somehow a window onto those two, but itself distinct. Because he mentioned Aristotle in this context, sorry, just let me adjust here. So because he mentioned Aristotle in this context, I wanted to take a few minutes to go over with you what Dugin says about Aristotle in chapter 4 of the volume that we've been looking at. So as I said, we covered the introduction in chapter 1. Last week, talked a bit about chapter 2. The chapter on Plato, we haven't gone into in detail. It's just I think it's the idea that Plato is Apollonian because of the emphasis on the ideas and so on. We will restate here, but I didn't go into Dugin's presentation in that chapter. But we will give this overview of chapter 4 of Aristotle, just enough to help bring out this Dionysian alternative to the Apollonian Platonism. Okay, so even if you've never studied Plato, you might have heard that he has a doctrine of forms or ideas. The basic idea here is that the most real reality, the most beingful beings, the truly most existing things that exist, are not what we see with our eyes and touch and feel with our hands. Our natural condition is kind of like in the allegory of the cave, that we are in a cave looking at shadows on a wall and regarding the shadows as the reality itself. Through intellectual ascent, through philosophical education, we can be liberated. There's some complexities, but we can be liberated from false appearance, from taking the shadows as the realities, into true reality. We can exit the cave, see the reflection of the tree outside of the cave in the water, then eventually see the tree, the stars, and the sun itself in the allegory. So the true reality that he describes as being outside the cave lies in the realm of ideas. Well, ideas or forms here, if you have heard about that, they're not like the ideas that you have in your head, like, oh, I had a great idea. But rather, the ideas are a technical term for the ontologically pure, intelligible reality that we know with our intellects as opposed to with our eyeballs. And there's a chain that connects us to them. They're not inaccessible. And there's not even a flaming sword, guarding them and prohibiting our access to them. There's a chain that somehow connects us to them through our soul and intellect, and we can ascend to a vision of the idea of the good, which even transcends being itself, and which, as it were, overflows into existence from its superabundance, okay, in Plato. So why does anything exist at all? Well, the source of existence is an outpouring or outflowing, a generous superabundance. Again, this is I'm oversimplifying to convey some basic ideas here. Well, in a dialogue called the Timaeus, Plato talks about 3 levels, which can help us to place Aristotle, and as well a version of the Black Logos, the 3 levels of reality, so to speak. And the levels are the original paradigm or idea, so that sort of like the intellectual blueprint for things. Then the copy, the phenomenon, okay, we don't see the original, that's what we see with our eyes and so on, okay, and that's what an artist can depict, a copy of an original. Well, there's also like an ontological original, and this is another level. And then also what he calls what's called in the Timaeus chora, also we can interpret as the space in which all this happens, or as matter in one interpretation. Okay, well, Aristotle criticizes the independence of what's outside of the cave. He says, for Plato, that realm of true reality, it exists independently, and we're most blessed when we have a vision of its independence and so on. Aristotle criticizes the independence of the ideas and paradigms in Dugin's presentation, and considers authentic only that which can be verified as a phenomenon. He takes his position in the in-between, okay, which is the domain of Dionysus, between matter and the ideas. That's preliminary. Now let's get into some more of the details. Aristotle doubts that the ideas or forms can exist without embodiment or phenomenological expression. In other words, as Dugin puts it here, for Aristotle, there is no experience of the ecstatic contemplation of noetic being, this purely and separated intellectual act, all the way to the good beyond being. Dugin, remember the importance for Dugin of the idea of an underlying experience. He says for Aristotle, there is no such experience. Apollonianism, Apollo, is based on the actuality of the contemplation of forms and paradigms, with such clarity that there's no doubt at all about their being and eminence. So an Apollonian philosophy is like, of course that world is real. We've penetrated through to it in some experience of intellectual contemplation. And compared to these forms and ideas, the phenomenological world seems to the Platonist unsubstantial. For the Platonist, gods are closer than men. Heaven is closer than earth. Theoretical comprehension and existence itself are one and the same. You only fully exist when you're in the act of intellectual comprehension of the ideas and of the idea of the good. Aristotle breaks the equation between being and theoretical comprehension, between being and intellectual seeing. Not Platonic contemplative comprehension, but some other experience of the world underlies Aristotle's philosophy. Aristotle, Dugin writes, is somehow concerned more with appearance than Plato is, paying more attention to the combination of form and matter than to the form alone. Moreover, even the meaning of matter, okay, what is matter? Even the interpretation or meaning of matter is different in these two logoi. Matter has an ontological status in Aristotle that it lacks in Plato. Again, even if you're a specialist, super specialist in Plato and Aristotle, and some of this is casting doubt, you should say and comment on it if you get a chance to. But for now, just bear with me so we can draw the relevant distinctions for Dugin. So matter has an ontological status in Aristotle that it lacks in Plato. Matter is that with which form needs to be coupled to appear. You need the combination of the two for something to appear. One by itself is not enough. Well, there is not first form and then matter, and then you combine them and then something appears. Rather, the appearing is primary. Dugin's presentation. In the beginning is the phenomenon, or the epiphany, which does not begin from either form or matter, but from the area between them. This between is primary. And you can see then why for Dugin, Aristotle is Dionysian as being between form and matter. And phenomenology and Heidegger and Dasein as the in-between is also Dionysian. So this logos, again, is in stark contrast to the Apollonian one. Yeah, I'll give you an oversimplified version of how matter can have a different ontological status. You might think in an Apollonian way that matter is nothing but the privation or lack of being. So it doesn't have any positive existence itself. It's somehow thought of as privation or lack. Whereas you might also think of it as having its own ontological status or having its own existence or mode of existence and not just being non-existence. So I don't want to get too into that, and we won't. We can leave it there on this topic. But last session, someone had suggested that perhaps the Stoics correspond to the dark logos among the Greek philosophers, if I recall correctly. And I just want to point out that Dugin says in this discussion that they fall short of Aristotle and tend rather towards the black logos in their rationalistic materialism. Okay, but I'll leave the details to the side. I just mentioned that for the benefit of whoever it was. I don't remember who made that point or suggestion. So a key point here about the Dionysian logos is that whereas for the Apollonian logos, matter is non-being, okay, I already said that, or does not possess a solid ontological foundation, the Dionysian logos treats matter, or more broadly, the lower world, not just matter, but the lower world, more substantively. It gives it more attention, and it, as it were, gives it more of a voice than the Apollonian logos does. And Dugin traces that in both Aristotle and also in another form of the Dionysian logos in another chapter, in the chapter on Gnosticism, where it has quite an in-depth, detailed account of the noetic structure of Gnosticism, which he sees as Dionysian. We could do a couple of sessions just on that, and I think it's quite interesting, but there's only so much we can cover in the time we have together. So that was meant to give you a sense of why Aristotle and how that's distinct from Plato, Apollo, Aristotle, Dionysus. We don't yet have a full introduction to the black logos, but rationalistic materialism, linear temporality, some of the other things that we said from last session, hopefully is beginning to give you an impression. Now I wanted to transition. I have a few sections or topics that begin to illustrate even more some of these differences and how they're applied to different realms, anthropology, history, and so on. So here his issue is the anthropology of the logoi. This is a huge question, and here's we'll touch upon it briefly. From the point of view of the logos of Dionysus, humanity is eternal. The human logos is the logos of Dionysus, because human between a higher world and a lower world. From the point of view of the logos of Apollo, man is a god who has temporarily descended into matter. What's primary, remember, is the peak of Mount Olympus here, and therefore we begin at the top and we descend and then reascend. And there's a whole Neoplatonic analysis of descent and ascent as it concerns man and the cosmos. The logos of Apollo is not so attached to man. He can do perfectly well with angels. Okay, he doesn't need man, but Dionysus is with humanity. If nothing happens, the Apollonian logos will not be upset. Even the end of the world is not a big problem for him. Remember, you can even say he observes the end of the world with serenity from the peak of Mount Olympus. But the logos of Dionysus is associated just with this anthropological problem. So as Dugin puts it, the logos of Dionysus and the secret of anthropology are closely related. Again, the Apollonian logos doesn't even necessarily pay such great attention to the problem of anthropology. The logos of the Great Mother, the black logos, is the logos of total dehumanization. But dehumanization is not from such a painful point of view. It is painful, but at the same time, it is very sweet. Feminism begins with the metaphor of a woman. It is simply very difficult for a woman to be a man. She experiences tremendous stress in being a man. She can't be a man because it is difficult for her. She wants to be freed from this. She can be freed from the dictates of men only by being freed at the same time from her humanity, in favor of a certain universality, stretching her own gender to new parallels. This takes the stress off of being human. It takes off the responsibility, and it transfers itself, and here Dugin refers to the Donna Haraway, transfers itself into the hands of the machine. It's harder for a woman to be obsessed with the masculine principle. For her, it's suffering. She seeks peace, but she finds horror. So it's the why Dugin thinks of the black logos as feminine, how he thinks of its rejection of the masculine, and therefore of all, and accordingly of all of gender and dehumanization. That's also a big question. Again, I'm just trying to give you an impression. But when he talks about, let me give you a quick connection to his analysis of Gnosticism. So he says that the Gnostics, they put the feminine principle in a way at the center of their analysis. In many respects, they share a Neoplatonic view of the world, where there's so it's not just materialist, it goes all the way up to the very first principle, to the manifestation of the first principle, and then to the return back to it. But whereas that return is unproblematic, as it were, for the Neoplatonists, for the Gnostics, there's a second principle, the feminine principle of Sophia. And when Sophia, through this complicated ontological structure that he actually maps out, I could show you the picture of it, when Sophia, as a result of the manifestation, ontological manifestation, tries to return back up, her return is frustrated. It's blocked. She experiences an obstacle in the return. And as a result of experiencing that obstacle, as a result of being blocked from the path back upwards to the Father of all things, she constitutes her own world. And there's a whole set of interpretations about our world as the world that Sophia has created, in a way out of frustration at not being able to return to the original source of all things, and so on. But because the Gnostics made Sophia feminine, and moreover have a set of correspondences where it, like, for example, world is masculine, not just grammatically, but in other ways, but soul is feminine, and so on. So there's a whole chain of masculine and feminine principles standing at the basis of the creation of the world. And so Dugin thinks that that analysis gives us insight into the black logos because of its attempt at its anger and frustration at not having been able to return, and the world that it creates, and so on, and also into the Dionysian logos. Let me just show you that so you can see. I think this is also worth seeing. Of course, there's no way, it's not translated, and we won't be able to discuss it. But if you look here, this is Dugin's mapping, to a certain extent, of the worldview of Valentinian Gnosticism. And if you see here, this is Sophia, who comes later in the chain of creation. Okay, these are the things that precede her in the chain of creation. Here's Sophia, and she tries to return directly to the source here, but is blocked from doing so by a limit. And even the notion of a limit gets analyzed a lot in Noomakhia. How is the limit understood in light of the three logoi? But here she gets blocked by something that is limiting her from that return. And she goes down here and becomes a doubled Sophia, a black Sophia, sort of a bitter Sophia, and engages in her own process of creation, which the Gnostics interpret in a specific way. So even when you hear Dugin speak about the feminine and the masculine, there's something else going on at a deeper level. Okay, so that was the anthropology of the Logoi. Apollo doesn't really care about humanity, whether it gets destroyed, so to speak. Dionysus does very much, and the Black Logos has her own specific form of dehumanization. So now the next issue is about post-history. So the debate about post-history is a debate about whether there will be an end to history, whether history has an end. So he writes that from the point of view of accelerationism, postmodernism, the logos of Cybele, the end can end forever. Okay, it's a sort of never-ending end, okay, or forever-ending end. The end is a process. Here, hence, because the end is such a process, hence you have such an attention to detail, to microparticles, immersion in nanoworlds, obsessed with the theory when he's writing of superstrings, of small fragments, infinitesimal quantities that create their own laws, their own structures. In other words, a division without limit. So he says that that's part of this endless end, an infinite subdivision here. In this regard, post-history is the entry into the cyclical repetition of a progressive funnel leading to an unattainable goal. The funnel goes lower and lower, but we are more and more subatomic, subatomic level, and we follow this indulgence into the abyss, which by definition has no bottom. If we visualize without a bottom, then from a certain angle, we will see falling into that abyss. If it is an abyss, it can be eternal. So no matter how much you fall, you won't reach the bottom. This creates a feeling of some eternity. It creates a feeling, a sense, some sort of like a simulacrum of eternity. It's a forever, but it's a forever falling. No matter how much you fall, you won't reach the bottom. This, he says, creates a feeling of some eternity, which cannot be the eternity of history, because history is finite. It has a certain limit. It has eschatology. This is precisely post-history, as he puts it here, where there is something, but nothing is there. Something is happening, but in this happening, there is no longer, there's not progression. There's a happening without meaning and without direction somehow. This is the progress. This is the project of the Sibyllian logos in the future, a repetition of the same. So I just wanted to show you that's one way that Dugin interprets time and falling and history and the end differently than you would do so from an Apollonian perspective. What can I say? There's a lot to cover. Here, the next discussion is about, and this now is from political Platonism. The discussion is about the three logoi and an idea of sacred history. Or in other words, what's the relationship between the geopolitics as a simple political science, simple as like not involving these other dimensions, geopolitics and Noomakhia. So the interviewer says, you say that in describing the war of the Athenians with the Atlantids, Proclus, the Neoplatonist, in fact describes the battle of two logoi, the logos of Apollo and the logos of Cybele. In the same way, do you think it's possible to view certain historical events in the context of noetic battles? And then she gives some examples. Can we say that the application of the model of the three logoi in attempting to explain historical processes will mean nothing other than contact with hiero history, sacred history? Dugin responds as follows. Precisely so. In polemics with me, some contemporary traditionalists insist that geopolitics is not a sacred science, but is fully exhausted by profane modernistic considerations in the spirit of strategic studies or political analysis. The example, he says, of Proclus, the Neoplatonist, disproves that opinion. That by itself, by the way, should be, I would think, immensely interesting for people who write about Dugin in terms of strategic studies in geopolitics. He is saying that the Neoplatonic geosophy can be a key for understanding the relationship between geopolitics and these other dimensions. Let me carry on with what he writes himself, or what he says. Geopolitics is built on the comprehension of qualitative space, which lies at the basis of sacred geography. We can say that geopolitics is a simplified and rationalized version of sacred geography. The entire structure of Ishraq philosophy, analyzed by Corbin in particular, is based on this metaphysical understanding of space. Yes, he acknowledges, the academic version of geopolitics is entirely rational and scientific, but it is easy to recognize deeper roots at its basis, which, by the way, is easy to see from my early book, Foundations of Geopolitics, infamous, where there is a chapter called From Sacred Geography to Geopolitics. In Proclus's interpretation of the history of Atlantis, given at the beginning of his study of the Timaeus, given at the beginning of the Timaeus itself, we see precisely an example of sacred geopolitics. I think that the symbols and models used by Plato and interpreted by Proclus in relation to the Atlantids, the people who lived in Atlantis, and the Athenians, describes with perfect precision the basic characteristics of land power on one hand and sea power on the other hand. In our time, these symbols and signs are also recognizable and intelligible, he writes, and he gives some examples. Well, let me just tell you. Right up to the pillars of Hercules on the dollar bill, with the reversed motto plus ultra instead of nec plus ultra. So nec plus ultra, nothing further, plus ultra, something further. Passing beyond the western limit of the Mediterranean, Indo-European culture enters the phase of hubris, i.e. violates measure, and falls under the influence of the logos of Cybele and the elements of Titanism. That is exactly what happened in Europe beginning in the 17th century and ending in the establishment of the New Babylon in the US. So analysis based on the three logoi is fully relevant for analysis of contemporary events and processes in a hiero-historical perspective. Well, all of Noomakhia is implicitly hiero-historical because it focuses on the sacred dimension as understood as the noetic dimension. So, but here he says we can supplement our understanding of scientific geopolitics with Noomachic geosophical sacred geopolitics. So that's another way in which these distinctions can be mapped onto what we know from our other domains. And again, I personally thought it was surprising and didn't expect it when I first read it, that Dugin himself points to Proclus the Neoplatonist as a serious source of inspiration for this way of interpreting political affairs, geopolitical affairs. Okay, now to the point that was made earlier, I have here a example of the application of this model to understanding Mediterranean civilization. I just have to emphasize again, this is brief. It's from outside of the book. It's from an interview, but it's to illustrate what it looks like to talk in terms of the Apollonian, Dionysian, and Sabellian when discussing not just the structures of the mind, but some sort of concrete cultural or civilizational entity. So he writes here, there's no doubt that the harbingers of primordial Achaean culture and their related Indo-European tribes in the West, Italy, and East Anatolia of the Mediterranean, so the origins of the Mediterranean civilization here, were vivid representatives of the trifunctional ideology of the heroic type, which is where there's a masculine, patriarchal, sacred, warrior-like society. This tripartite I have in my notes, and I'll tell you later. Analysis of Indo-European society as comprised of priests, warriors, and commoners. Okay, so he says that accurately describes these harbingers of Mediterranean civilization. It can be said that their logos was primarily the light logos, and Apollo or his prototypes acted as and Zeus acted as its main personification in myth. This was a heavenly philosophy dominated by the vertical, a series of male symbols, and a diurnal regime, according to Gilbert Durand. Therefore, we should presume an Apollonian element to be in the foundations and in the very origin of Mediterranean civilization. And this was not a result of evolution or the product of external influence. The ancestors of the ancient Greeks who arrived in this area were, he says, at least according to Guénon and Evola, bearers of the solar logos. Okay? In other words, that logos was there even with the ancestors. The solar logos was the axis of the political and caste elite of the Mediterranean civilization, of the priests and warriors. The domination of the light logos also affected those of the third function, the commoners, who, with Hellenization, absorbed the structures of the Olympic ideology. So Dugin's view, and I have more to say about this, we're just starting. Dugin's view is that the Apollonian logos of the ancestors of the ancient Greeks collided with the societies of the people inhabiting that area with a different culture and ideology, matriarchal cultures that manifested the black logos of Cybele, the Pelasgians and Minoans, for example. In other words, the Indo-European, Achaean, Apollonian, and patriarchal logos asserted its dominance in a space with what had previously been a matriarchal structured culture. The resulting collision between these two logoi, the logoi of the Apollonian newcomers and the logos of the matriarchal indigenous ones, in other words, this specific episode of Noomakhia, concluded with the full and unreserved triumph of the logos of Apollo. Mediterranean culture, as a matrix of European culture, was first and foremost, in an external sense, originally and fundamentally a culture of the light logos. So you had, these come with the light logos, these ones are the black logos, the light logos is victorious over them. Mediterranean civilization was founded as the institution of the Olympic victory of the gods over the Titans, of Apollo and Zeus over the creatures of the Great Mother, the light logos over the black logos, the world of ideas over a tract of space, Kora, referring to that third level in Timaeus. So what then, okay, you have a relationship between the two logoi, namely the victory of one over the other in this encounter. Well, what about the Dionysian? Can we determine its position in this noological matrix in the Mediterranean? Well, Dugin's analysis is that in the radical victory of Apollo over Cybele and the gods over the Titans, Dionysus was comprehended as a figure who stood on the side of the gods. Through him is channeled the communication between the ontological, teleological, cosmological, and gnosiological top, and the cosmological, ontological, teleological, and so on bottom. So he's a mediator, but he mediates on behalf of and for the benefit of the top. Apollo's domination in Mediterranean civilization determined the fate of Dionysus as well. He was conceptualized as a ray of heaven pointing towards earth and hell. But he's a ray of heaven. He's aligned with Apollo. He was conceptualized as the beloved son of Olympian Zeus, as the sun descending into night. Hence the very choice of the god's gender, Dugin remarks. While androgynous by virtue of his intermediate position, he is thought of as a male god, as savior, groom and savior. His trajectory is from there to here. He's witness of the gods and a god among gods. Okay, so the victory of the Apollonian over the Cybelian determines the meaning of the Dionysian also. Dionysus descends to chaos, ready to deal with what is imperfect, but he translates chaos into order, perfects the imperfect in this context. His role in the Mediterranean civilization of the light logos is also bright, although it's qualitatively darker than Apollo. That's how Dugin describes the initial and fundamental structure of Noomakhia for the Mediterranean region in its Hellenistic and then Greco-Roman and Western European version. The logos of Mediterranean civilization is dominated by Apollo. Cybele is completely subordinate to and suppressed by it. And Dionysus, fulfilling communication between the top and the bottom of the noetic and cosmological topography, transmits, as Dugin puts it, mostly eidetic rays from heaven to the masses of the earth. So he specifically is serving an Apollonian role. I think it's worth continuing here, so just let me go on if you don't mind. The starting point, therefore, of Mediterranean civilization predetermined the basic proportions of its historical being up to the present time. Therefore, Dugin emphasizes, when we speak of the decline of Europe or of the crisis of Western civilization, we consciously or unconsciously have in mind the crisis of the light logos, the tragedy of Apollo. That's an important point, I think, that on what is the decline of the West, the crisis of the West, on this model, it's the decline of the Apollonian logos. Whether freely or instinctively, as Dugin puts it, in speaking about the crisis of the West, we mean the crisis of the Apollonian West, the West which we know from antiquity and the Middle Ages. This is Apollo being mourned by those recording the catastrophe of modern Western culture. If this is so, then the final episode of the historical cycle of Mediterranean civilization should be considered the departure of Apollo, his withdrawal, disappearance, or flight. In this case, the starting point of Mediterranean civilization is the radical moment of Apollo's victory over Cybele, and the final point is the one we find ourselves in now, with the weakening of Apollo, the fall of Apollo, the end of his reign. The enigmatic myths about the impending end of Zeus's reign, which are related in particular to the tales of the swallowing of the female titan Metis and the birth of Athena, might be directly related to this. The end of Western civilization is the end of the rule of the light logos of Apollo. But what if we see this picture of the rise and fall of the West from the perspective of another Logos. What if we now follow the same trajectory from the standpoint of the black Logos of Cybele? Then the picture turns out to be entirely different. The starting point is the subordination of the feminine to the masculine. Remember, the Pelasgians and so on, the matriarchal cultures that were successfully subdued by the Apollonian. That would be the starting point, the subordination of the feminine to the masculine. So for the Logos of Cybele, this Apollonian beginning is not really its own. The Logos of Cybele dates back to the distant pre-Indo-European past or to non-Indo-European adjacent fields, such as the Egyptian or Semitic ones, if we restrict ourselves to the Mediterranean. Therefore, Cybele sees Apollo's invasion as an episode that is quite recent in comparison to the deep underground time of the Great Mother. She admits defeat in Titanomachia in the Battle of the Titans and in the Battle of the Giants, and she mourns her children who fell at the hands of the Olympians. As Apollo's power weakens, she's gradually liberated. The Titans' wounds are healed, and they slowly begin to make their way up to the Earth's surface. I continue. The first of the Titans to rise to Olympus is Prometheus. This Titan seeks to imitate the gods, to share his tonic or underground wisdom with them, and borrow their sacred skills of rule. For the Great Mother, time is progress, and this is wholly justified insofar as the Titan's strength grows in relation to the weakening of the gods. So maybe it had its phase of the end of history, and now it's coming back with the reassertion of the Titanic. By progress can be understood only the progress of the tonic underground forces, the liberation of the ancient powers imprisoned in Tartarus. This is the counterattack of the giants. This is the humanism of modernity. The end of Western civilization and the drift towards this end is, for the tonic or underground forces, true development, becoming progress and the nearing of a long-awaited triumph. On the other hand, the finale of such progress might be the kingdom of the woman, quote unquote. This coincides with the Hindu tradition's definition of the present time as the Kali Yuga, the kingdom of the black goddess Kali. Okay, a little bit more, okay? Those for whom, this is a key point too, in the application of the logoi to our understanding, our place and time, especially the crisis of Western civilization. Those for whom Western civilization is not in crisis simply do not belong to it by and large. They are not the voice of Western civilization, but the voice of the black logos. Today, only a non-European can be a Euro-optimist. Okay, so what do you think about that? We're leaving for a minute Dionysus to the side, and we'll probably end the session on the Dionysian perspective on this. That's next. But what do you think about what Dugin is saying here? Europe is primarily Apollonian. The crisis of Europe is the crisis of Apollo. Anyone who does not acknowledge the crisis of Europe is not European, but rather the bearer of another logos or another world configuration. So my question to you is, does that make sense? And is it a helpful way of looking at things? Back to the original question. Is looking at Western civilization and its crisis in terms of these three noetic, logoic structures helpful? And again, those of you who are watching the recording, I encourage you to email me or post in the forum your thoughts on that question. So just in the interests of time, I'll leave it a rhetorical question for now, or one that you can ponder. And let's go to Dionysus. This will take us just a few minutes past 7:30 and we'll stop. How does Dionysus see the fate of the West today? Everything is more complicated here, Dugin writes. The zone of Dionysus, his kingdom, is located between the light logos of Apollo and the black logos of Cybele. We know that now. He's identical to himself, both in heaven and on earth. He's close to both natures, divine and human. Dionysus understands the logic both of patriarchy and matriarchy. But in Mediterranean culture, Dionysus turns out to be integrated into the model of the Apollonian order and is the distributor of this order to the underground levels of being. Dionysus is the savior, the initiator. His place is in the army of gods. He has his own scores to settle with the Titans who tear him apart. The fate of Dionysus in the West is inseparable from that of Apollo. Therefore, in following this line, he also perceives modernity as dark times and shares the fate of all the other Olympian gods. In this sense, we can speak of a flight of Dionysus. In this sense, the flight of Apollo carries with it a certain flight of Dionysus. However, Dionysus is not so rigidly bound to Apollo. In the Apollonian kingdom, he acts as son of the father. But if we look at him from the other position, then he can be seen as the son of the mother. His link to Cybele, who is recovering from madness, opens from the other side. Here we are approaching, Dugin writes, a very complex and obviously even dangerous topic that can be formulated as Dionysus and his double. The dark logos which brings light to all those areas of the world which Apollo's sun does not penetrate can at twilight acquire disturbing traits. In these twilights, Wagner's Twilight of the Gods, Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols, or Evoloh's Twilight of the Heroes, he can be perceived as a titan. After all, Heraclitus said in Fragment 15, Hades is the same as Dionysus. The meaning of the Logos of Dionysus is that it is not the same, right? Because it's different from the Black Logos of Hades. But the similarity remains. This theme, he says, is related to the shadows of Dionysus and the ambiguity of certain decadent Dionysian themes. In short, there is, quote unquote, another Dionysus, a non-European one, not the one whom we know from the classical era of history, a proto-Dionysus or post-Dionysus. Almost done. If for solar Dionysus, the decline of Europe is this civilization's midnight, followed by a new dawn, the return of Dionysus, then for his tonic double, it's the attainment of a secret goal, the center of hell. And the aim is to fix time in its infernal climax, thus making hell eternal and everlasting. A little bit mysterious, but the point here I think is clear. The Dionysus that we know is the Apollonian Dionysus, but there is a great phrase coming up. So in this case, this double the Dionysus that we get with the Black Logos in its titanic reemergence, unlike the straightforward and catastrophic view of the light Logos and the progressive titanism of the Black Logos, the relationship of the dark Logos of Dionysus to modern Western European culture becomes highly ambiguous, as it is based on the complex operation of the quote-unquote differentiation of Dionysii. Many Dionysuses, okay, many Dionysii, differentiation of them. There's so much more we can say about that. Just think about this. Number one, those people who talk about a crisis of Western Europe, speaking about the crisis of Apollo. Those people who oppose it, speaking from the point of view of Cybele. Those people who are Dionysian but defend it, but defend the West, may be defending the Apollonian Dionysus. But Dugin wouldn't rest content with that. Noomakhia couldn't rest content with that. His methodology would be undone if he had just a loyalty to the Apollonian Dionysus, for instance, to the savior of Western civilization, to all of that. So we enter into the dangerous operation of the differentiation of Dionysi. There's an Apollonian Dionysus. That's not the only one. Okay, the Apollonian, these are my last few remarks. There is an Apollonian Dionysus. We know that. Let me leave that aside. We can stop here. No, I'm going to say it. There is an Apollonian Dionysus, but that's not the only Dionysus. We must concern ourselves with this complex operation of the differentiation of Dionysi, to use Dugin's phrase. The Apollonian Dionysus is not even a logos, Dugin says, at times. Okay, why? There is a Dionysian component to the Apollonian logos, which in his Neoplatonism consists in the contemplation of the good beyond being. It's Dionysian because you're rational all the way up to the peak of being, but you are now mad, drunk, or irrational when you transcend being to the beyond being. That's the Dionysian component in the Apollonian logos in the Neoplatonic version. So the Dionysian component consists in the contemplation of the good which is beyond being. It's the supra-rational component of the upwards ascent. It's the focus on that apophatic or concealed one. But that is, again, to re-emphasize here, even in its other versions, precisely the Apollonian Dionysus. There's also the Dionysian Dionysus, which has a different character, as does the Sabellian Dionysus, and there are nuances within them and within the various permutations and superimpositions that are possible when we add the dynamic dimension of space and time. And that, I want to say, gives us the richness of Noomakhia. Okay, clearly we have to stop, 7:36. I just want to give credit to Yaffe Arnold. He is the translator of some of what I've been reading to you, some of which is available on 4pt.su in this article called The Logos of Europe, Catastrophe and the Horizons of Another Beginning. So I want to thank you very much for your time, attention, and participation. And as usual, you can comment if you'd like on the forum or by email. And as usual, I encourage you to anything that you'd like to say on Twitter. I welcome the public dimension of the discussion too. Thank you.